Okay, so here we go. What is blended learning? We're going to start with some definitions here. Now here's the fun part. If you've been in education long enough, you know a few things. One, definitions, terms, and buzzwords come and go so quickly. And then two, unlike other professions, we have lots of different working definitions for the exact same terms and phrases. For some, that can be infuriating and frustrating, and for others, it can actually be liberating. Well, I'd invite you to choose the liberating route, because the goal here is not for you to have a perfect, precise definition of blended learning. It's to get informed about the possibilities of blended learning and then try it out in your classroom, even if you don't know what to call it or exactly how to define it. But I think it can be helpful just to build a foundation for us to talk about definitions. So I'm going to take you through 4 possible definitions, and you can think about comparing and contrasting them a little bit. The first one comes from the Sloan Foundation, and they define blended learning as simply a course where 30 to 70% of the learning takes place online, or sometimes I think they say instruction, but where the teaching and learning takes place online 30 to 70% of the time. So that's one way of thinking about blended learning. It's a face-to-face class, but students spend 30 to 70% of the time doing their learning in an online environment as opposed to that face-to-face environment. A second definition comes from 2012. It's a little article that I found, and you'll be able to find it online as well, from MIT, where Pankin, Roberts, and Savio described how they approach blended learning at MIT. And let me just read it to you. We define blended learning as structured opportunities to learn which use more than one learning or training method inside or outside the classroom. So that's an interesting one, right? Because they don't actually mention technology or online at all. They're talking about blended learning as taking different opportunities for learning, different methods inside and out of the classroom, and putting them together to create a great learning experience. Well, let me take you to a third one. And this one, if you're in the K-12 world, this is a definition that's probably one of the most widespread. It comes from the Clayton Christensen Institute. And I find this to be really helpful, so we'll unpack it together here for a moment. It's a formal education program where students learn at least partly through online learning with some control over time, pace, place, and pathway. That's the first part. 2, at least partly supervised in a brick and mortar location away from home. And then the third part, these online and brick and mortar experiences are blended into a cohesive and connected learning experience. Now let's go back and take each of those apart briefly. The first part, formal education program where students learn at least partly through online learning with some control over time, pace, place, and pathway. So here we have, like from the first definition, some of the instruction takes place online, some of it takes place offline or in the face-to-face classroom. But this second part of that first part, I know that's a little confusing, is really interesting. Because at least partly online with some control over time, pace, place, and pathway. What does that mean? Well, I think in those 4 words, there is some rich, powerful meaning. So let's pay attention to them. First of all, students gain some control over time. You're in a regular classroom, and I often use the example of a remote control. In fact, there's one right here. So here's a remote control, right? And let's imagine that you're sitting in a class, and you're bored out of your mind. And you look down, and you notice this remote control that's sitting on the ground. And in a moment of playfulness, you grab the remote control, point it at the teacher, and press pause. And lo and behold, to your surprise, the instructor pauses and you realize like this is some Disney or movie-like experience. You're pretty excited. You move from almost falling asleep from boredom to just being giddy with what you're going to get to do over the next half an hour or hour. And so over that next time period, you fast forward and rewind and pause, and you start to discover that this is a pretty powerful learning experience. You can rewind the instructor to repeat things that you were confused about. You can fast forward through things that you already know. You can record things to review them later. You can even do picture-in-picture so you can see what's happening in another part of the world that maybe relates to what you're learning. That seems like some kind of magical fairy tale, right? Except that we are in an age where we can actually give students an equivalent of a learning remote control. When we think about blending face-to-face and online instruction, we can actually create experiences that allow students to have some control over the times in which they learn and the paces at which they learn. We can actually differentiate by time, something that teachers have struggled with for years and years. So that's time and pace. Place is another one. Blended learning gives you a chance to have students learning regardless of where they're located, or to take advantage of different locations. And that's one thing I like about that MIT definition before, because if you think of blended learning, you ask the question of what's the best place for students to learn this? Is it better for them to do this in the evening at home, in their libraries, in the classroom, and other places in the community? I mean, we can do some cool stuff here when we think about blending learning experiences across locations, across places. And we'll get to think about that in the class. And then the last part of that, time, pace, place, and path or pathway. Now let's imagine that you're sitting in a room, and in that room there are about 50 people. And there are 2 exits, one on the right side, one on the left side. Now let's imagine that something happened where you all have to get out of that room really quickly. Now it would be absurd to have everyone line up in a single file line and follow the teacher out of one of the doors that of the teacher's preference. Why? Because you have to get out quickly, and not everyone in the room is in the same place, right? And so the best strategy to get out of the room for each learner or each person is going to be different because they're in a different place. You get the connection, right? It's the same thing with our learners. Not every learner is in the same place in our classes. And yet oftentimes, we design learning experiences that take everyone through the exact same path to a shared goal. What if we could imagine it differently? What if we could imagine learning experiences where each person, or many people, had different pathways, but to the same goal or end? That's the power and possibility of blended learning. I have one last definition for you, and this is my own. It's simply that blended learning is taking the best of face-to-face learning and combining it with the best of online or digital education. You put it together and you create something that really works for your classroom and your school. Let me give you a simple example. So with this example, let's say that I want to make the perfect mixed drink. I have a couple of my favorite beverages here. Here's the first one. It's about a third full. And then I have something sweet to add to the mix, right? Not quite sweet enough for me. Let's just pour it all in there. There we go. Nice and sweet, I hope. Actually pretty good, right? This is the right mix. That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to figure out what is the right mix for our students. What opportunities would be best amplified or improved by adding some digital and online learning experiences, and which ones work best with a really personal, face-to-face, up-close kind of experience. How do we combine those two to create the perfect, or at least the best or ideal learning experience for our students in a given time and place and situation? That's kind of the dream or the goal that we're pursuing as we explore this course together.